so I've got to somehow work those two together. We'll see how that goes. But we're going to read the story of Christmas this morning. We're going to look at this story. Now, this story is, I think, probably for most of us very, very familiar, right? It's something we read every year. It's probably one of the sections of the Bible that most people are fairly familiar with. You know, if you've read the Bible at all, these are the stories that we probably have heard before. So we're going to have two lots of readings this morning. I'm going to invite Devon. Do you want to come up, and Olivia? They're going to read for us first. And you guys are reading from the Gospel of Luke, right? So this, we're going to hear some of the Christmas story from Luke and then some of the Christmas story from the Gospel of Matthew. I'm going to ask a few questions afterwards. So listen to it. Try to listen with fresh ears. It's hard to do that, but try and imagine taking this story in for the first time as these guys read to us.
In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn.
And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for you, for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Suddenly, a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men on whom his favor rests." When the angel had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about."
So they hurried up and found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger. When they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told to them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told.
Great. Thank you. So that's Luke's account. Luke has Jesus from Nazareth, right? So, Jesus is, by all accounts, from Nazareth, and they have to make this journey to Bethlehem because of a census being taken. Matthew tells the story slightly differently. According to Matthew, Jesus is from Bethlehem and ends up in Nazareth a different way. And Oliver and Colin are going to come and read to us now, and just the Matthew version of this story, which is it's the same story from a slightly different perspective. That story, some would say the story in Luke is more from Mary's perspective. Some would say the story in Matthew is more from Joseph's perspective. You could look at it that way perhaps. But let's listen to another part of the story from Oliver and Colin.
After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them this exact same time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down to him and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all boys in Bethlehem in its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more."
After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea, in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said to the prophets, that he would be called Nazarene.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Let's give all those readers a big round of applause. Great job. Excellent. Okay, so let's just put it there. What did you notice about that story? What stuck out to you, maybe for the first time, or just because it was reinforced for you? Obviously, there's a lot of stuff going on in that story. But anything stand out to you? I mean, any impressions? Anyone want to share anything? Yeah. Dan. Yeah. 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 Okay. So what, for those that didn't hear what Dan was saying, there's government, power in both stories. Government. You got on the one hand Augustus Caesar in Luke, and Quirinius, the governor. It's a difficult word, that Quirinius, the governor, deciding there's a census, and so they have to move. People have to move around, travel. And in the second story, we've got Herod killing all these young boys in order to kill Jesus, or try and kill Jesus. Anything else that strikes you?
There was a general, seemed to be more of a reference to fulfilling prophecy in Matthew.
Yeah. Matthew's constantly saying this happened in order to fulfill a prophecy. Oh, great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah. So, yeah.
Just how many times having dreams
Yeah.
that people were given information through their dreams?
Yeah, a lot of dreaming.
It really stood out to me.
Yeah, okay, that struck you, yeah. Sort of, and perhaps there's that sense of God's presence, right? There's communication going on.
But they had to be open to it.
Right, and openness, yeah. Great point, yeah. Anybody else today? Yes.
In this time when we're dealing with so many refugees in our world today, it just struck me how often Jesus, Mary, and Joseph had to flee and were refugees themselves.
Yeah. In both stories. Mm-hmm. They're making journeys in both stories, and not because of decisions they've made, because of decisions other people have made, or situations that were out of their control. Yeah. That's good. We'll have one more. Anybody want to? It's typical, isn't it, Sarah? And then we'll have that last one over the far corner. We'll call it there. You got the last word, Jimmy.
Okay. Well, I noticed that at first they got a message that it was safe to return. Mm-hmm. That the people who wanted to kill them were dead. But then soon after that, they got I don't know if it was a vision or a dream that warned them to take shelter and that it wasn't safe.
Yeah.
So I had noticed that before. It was sort of like there's a certain fluidity to the instructions they were getting. It was sort of like, you're safe, be careful, and there's just sort of like,
it kind of changes.
It wasn't just one concrete pillar, It was sort of like very fluid.
That's a really interesting observation. Yeah, it's not like there's this whole plan, but it's like they're taking a step at a time, and things are changing. It's a very fluid, dynamic situation. Yeah. Well, the thing that strikes me, and a number of you have brought this out. thing that strikes me about the story is that it's a story that is, on the one hand, it's very hopeful, and it's, I mentioned we're talking about hope today. It's very hopeful. It's got some beautiful things in it, right? And the sort of things that we tend to emphasize at Christmas time. I mean, I think we perhaps overly glamorize this story. We overly beautify this story to a certain degree. And we emphasize things like the angels. There were angels in the story. Nobody mentioned that, actually. Nobody referenced that as an unusual thing. We have some dreaming, and clearly the presence of God. There's a sort of divine presence in this story with unusual things happening. There's a star that appears and guides these magi to their destination. So there's these sort of fantastic things. But actually, overall, I think the story, in many ways, is a very dark story, right? It's a story about tyranny. We've got Augustus Caesar directing Quirinius to carry out a census that was really oppressive. Basically, that was about counting people to make sure that enough taxes were taken. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that event, doing that census, sparked and ignited and brought together a lot of the revolutionaries in Palestine at that time, particularly in the Galilean region where Nazareth is. And it's the beginnings of the Zealot Party, the political movement that wanted to overthrow through armed means the Roman Empire. That movement got it didn't exactly start then, but it catalyzed that movement. There was an attack on a Roman garrison not long after that, just a few miles from Nazareth. That was kind of one of the touch points that really sort of took off in terms of the rebellion. So this was an oppressive act. We've mentioned already refugees. So think about it. Herod is killing all these kids. I mean, it's unbelievably atrocious. It's an unbelievably dark thing. And Jesus has to flee. The family have to flee. They go down to Egypt. And then they come back, as we mentioned already, they're kind of scared again. They're moving around. There's a lot that is dark and sinister and difficult. There's a lot of poverty going on, right? We know that Galilee was a very poor area. Nazareth, in particular, was a very poor town. So there's a lot of difficulty and struggle and darkness and oppression and vulnerability in this story. And we can, I think it's very easy for us to pass over that because, for instance, you take that journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, the journey that Luke talks about. Well, that's about 100 miles. Mary presumably was very pregnant. There's no mention of a donkey in that story. On all the Christmas cards, there's always a donkey, right? Mary's on the donkey. There's no mention of a donkey in that story. So, maybe there was a donkey. Maybe there was a horse and cart. Who knows? But we're not talking about that. They had to make that trek. It probably took them well over a week to make that journey. Really difficult journey to make. So there's a lot of painful struggle. And as somebody mentioned, I think, there's a lot of things that don't seem in control. So we have a couple of ways we can look at the story. We can read this story, as I think we tend to do, and as I think to some degree the stories are written as though there's this great plan, like God has this plan, it's all mapped out, and it's a bit scary here and there, and there's some twists and turns to the plot, but basically God's got it all under control, and everything's going to be okay. And it's, the darkness is just to add a bit of excitement to the story, right? That's one way of reading it, and that's the way we read it when we know the end of the story, right? We tend to, because without giving the plot away, about Christmas and everything, but we know what happens, right? We know the story, so we are reading it with that kind of objectivity. We're somewhat removed from it. If you're in that story, and I want to try and encourage us to maybe read it from that perspective. If you're in that story, I think it's a very different experience, right? It's an experience of a plan. What kind of a plan is this? We're being threatened. I mean, this is not a story about control. This is just the miracle of Christmas, let's say, is that God with us means God is being vulnerable. God is coming into this story and risking death, risking being snuffed out, risking the whole plan going to hell, if you pardon the expression. So we have two ways of looking at it. I want to encourage us to look at it and read this story from the second perspective. There's a couple of reasons, actually three reasons I would suggest that we do that. One, because my story is not one where everything is planned out perfectly, right? You know, I turned 50 this year, and I've been doing a lot of sort of reflecting, looking back, and we do that at certain times of the year. We do that, I think, towards the end of any year, and we do a lot of that, I think, at Christmas time. We kind of look back and reflect on life in general. Has anybody's life ever worked out the way they planned it? Or has anybody had a totally free ride, you know, where everything's gone perfectly, beautifully? Right? We have all kinds of difficulties in our lives, all kinds of struggles, all kinds of things that don't seem to make sense, all kinds of things that frankly don't seem very fair. And when we look at the world, here's the second reason, the world seems desperately unfair. If there is some great plan, it feels like it favors certain people and doesn't favor others. And that doesn't seem very fair at all. If you're rich and powerful and successful and you've got lots of control over things, then life's going to be pretty much okay for you. But if you're not born in the right country or the right place or at the right time, life's going to be a struggle. And that is most of our reality, right? That's how it is. We are all dealing with things right now that are really difficult in our lives. We're facing death, we're facing grief, we're facing loss, we're facing difficulties in relationships, we're facing all kinds of things, some of which are as a result of things we've done. You know, so you could say we have some control over them. Most of which, though, we do not have 100% control of, and some of which we have virtually no control over whatsoever. Like things like government decisions, like Augustus Caesar and Quirinius or Herod, and things where stuff just happens, right? And that's how life is for most of us. I also think it's how life was for most of the people reading and writing even these stories originally. If you think about it, the early Jesus movement, the early church, was persecuted, suffered, had all kinds of calamity going on, and I think we're asking a lot of questions and puzzling through, like, what's going on? Where is God in all of this? There's an expectation clearly from the early scriptures that Jesus, who had died and come back to life and then wasn't present anymore, was going to come back. And part of the reason why they started writing stories down eventually was because they realized that Jesus wasn't coming back anytime soon. And so there's potential there for disappointment and disillusionment and a sense of lostness. And so what we have here is a story that I think gives meaning in that kind of context in a different way than if we assume that it's all this wonderful, beautiful fairy tale story that's all mapped out and planned out, and it was actually a beautiful story to be in. It's a difficult story to be in. But I think that makes it more relatable, right? We can connect with this story in a different kind of way. We can connect with hope in this story in a different kind of way, because this is about hope in the here and now, in the darkness, in the nitty-gritty of life, in the trenches, if you like, of life, in the struggle of life, rather than hope just being something in the future. Now, clearly, hope does have something to do with the future. Okay, and we look forward to a time where maybe our problems will be overcome, or where tears will be wiped away. We look forward to another era in our lives, if you like, or another era even in our existence, in our reality. But hope has to have a reality in the present. And I think what we're seeing in this story, and what, for me, the miracle of Christmas is that God is coming into all this darkness. God is present in this difficulty. And not only that, God enters into the suffering, enters into the failure, enters into all that darkness with us. That's what Christmas is about. It's about Emmanuel, God with us. God is with us in all of this, rather than outside of it, controlling it all and moving everybody around like pawns. Right? In one reading of the story, those powers that be are just pawns in God's hands, and God's moving them. Oh, that's a bit of death and violence. They can do this, they can make this decision. In another way of reading the story, those powers that be are to a certain degree a law unto themselves, making bad choices, evil choices, dark choices, to which we and the rest of the world then become subject. But God is with us in that subjectivity. God is with us in that darkness. God is with us in that suffering. And the question is, how do we experience that? How do we embrace that? I wanted to share a story this morning. That's sort of a family story of mine. I was talking about looking back. This is sort of looking back even before I was born. It's a story I think I shared here, but quite a long time ago. so you may have forgotten it, and I'll get away with telling it again. But it's a story from the Second World War. Now, the Second World War is one of those stories that gets read or told certain ways, right? We have, it's generally told from the point of view of power. We think about leaders like Churchill and Hitler. We think about good versus evil, right? We all make our choices about that. We think of great acts of heroism. And, you know, I come from England. A lot of the memories and stories that are told about the Second World War are the kind of like the plucky English courage that got us through the Blitz and got us through all those things. Probably from an American perspective, the story is told as America riding in, kind of at the last minute, by the way, and then rescuing Europe. You know. We all have a way of telling the story, right? But it tends to get told in a very, I think, when we look back in a somewhat romanticized, kind of fairy tale kind of way. And part of that is because we know the outcome, right? We know the end of the story. Now, in another way, the story's not over, right? There's all sorts of things that happen. The Second World War was the beginning of something in many respects. And, you know, but that part of the story, anyway, we know how it resolved, and we can look back at it almost sort of nostalgically and romantically. I want to tell a little bit of this story, though, from somebody else's perspective. Maybe we can put that first slide up. And this is from the perspective of this woman who's, at the time of the story I'm going to tell, she was 21 years of age. And this is, I think she's 19 at this point. And this is my grandmother on my mother's side. Mary MacDonald, Mary Lloyd, as she became. And she lived in a city in England called Hull, which I think we have a map of England. This is a more accurate map of the Holy Land. We were talking about travels in the Holy Land earlier. So I don't have my pointer on me, but about halfway up the British Isles on the right-hand side, on the east side, is this city called Hull. It's on a river called the Humber, and it was at this time back in the 1940s. It was a big shipping port. It's sort of been through lots of changes in more recent times, but it was a pretty significant city. And it became very significant in the early 40s, so not by 1941, which is when I set this story, became very significant because Hitler had been attacking England. You know, we've had the Blitz, or the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, and all those things were going on. And London was the main target, and other cities too. But then the German attention shifted more towards Russia, and Britain was helping the Russians, and we were shipping munitions out to Russia because you get it, across the North Sea and to Russia that way. And Hull was one of the main ports that was shipping out to Russia. So they decided to bomb the heck out of Hull. And it started off, there were a few raids here and there, and then there were several raids that were really devastating raids. Now, on July the 18th, it was 1941. My grandmother, who I just showed you, was going to work, and she went to her mother's house, or my great-grandmother's house, to drop off her daughter, my mother, who was 2 years old at the time. And she wanted her to look after her. It was late evening or late afternoon, and she was going to look after her that night. My grandmother was working a night job. And for some strange reason, her mother, my great-grandmother, said, she can't stay here tonight. And I'm not exactly sure what happened there. All I know is it was a bit weird, and her mother was like, she just can't stay here, it doesn't work out. And my grandmother was actually pretty cross, pretty angry. Had to take my mother to another friend's house and felt that she was imposing on her. It was all very, very inconvenient. That night, there was the worst air raid there's been. They just dropped, I forget the number of bombs, it was a huge number of bombs onto Hull. And my grandmother's family, who were all at that house, went into the local shelter. And actually, I think it was the next door neighbour had the shelter. There were shelters built, and not every house had its own shelter. So they went into the bomb shelter, and there was a direct hit on the bomb shelter. And so all of my grandmother's family were killed. So that was her mother, her father. She had 9 brothers and sisters. Only 2 of them survived, and that was because there were two brothers who were fighting overseas. So they weren't there to go into the shelter. And it was this devastating moment in her life. absolutely devastating moment. She had to go the next day to identify, this is just horrible, identify body parts. And there are lots of other people that died too, but it was mainly her family in this one particular shelter that got hit. And she was sort of pulling stuff out of the rubble. It was just, I can't imagine what that must have been like. One of the things she pulled out of the rubble I actually have here, which is a picture of her father. I think we have the next slide. Yeah. So this is my great-grandfather, who I obviously never met. And my grandma was very close to this man. He's got a very interesting story actually, because nobody knows where he came from. He was a baby left on a doorstep. It's very hard for me to trace my family back. Actually, but on my mother's side and my father's side, we don't really do that much in England, though. Actually, we don't trace our history like as much as you guys do here. Maybe that's why. I remember talking to my grandmother a lot about this event. I mean, she spent years not talking about it, but by the time I was a teenager, I'd ask her a lot of questions, and gradually she would begin to talk about it. And she told me about going through the rubble, and she just found this picture. I'm going to send it around. It's if you could just handle it carefully, because I want to keep it the rest of my life, obviously. But I'm going to just pass it around. She fished that out. It just caught her eye as she was going through it. But she was pulling out all kinds of stuff out of the rubble, and that picture kind of represents the pain of loss, the loss of her grandfather, of her father, the loss of her family, and really it represented something that was a massive part for the rest of her life. Right? We talk about these stories, okay? The story of the Second World War, and we celebrate victory, we celebrate freedom, we celebrate all these different things, but no amount of victory, no amount of celebration, no amount of grandiose plan or fairy tale or romance could in any way take away the pain, the reality of somebody like my grandmother who had no say in what happened, who doesn't view the plucky English spirit as this wonderful, great thing that got everybody through, but just thinks about that time as incredible grief, incredible trauma, incredible difficulty. And but my grandmother persevered. Right? She was not a particularly religious woman. I would say, honestly, she was a pretty hard and at times quite bitter woman. I think we could probably all say understandably. But she persevered. And I noticed probably about the time when I was a teenager, that for whatever reason I was kind of special to my grandmother, sorry. I didn't realize I'd get emotional. But I realized that I was special to my grandmother. And I'm not a 4, and I'm not even going to say that I was the favourite or anything like that. Though I think possibly. But she just attached to me and told me lots of stories about this event and other events in her life. And it turned out, I realized after a while, that she had a brother, and I think we have a picture of this guy, George, who died in that shelter, who looked just like me. Now, I don't particularly think he looks like me, but for whatever reason, when I came along, I reminded her of George, and George was her favourite brother. And I think we've got some other pictures of George here when he grew up. So this was around about the time that he died. Again, I don't think I look like him, but for whatever reason, I reminded my mother of George. And she would talk to me a lot about this guy. We can keep going through that's something she pulled out. Another thing she gave me, she pulled out George's birth certificate out of the rubble. I got that as well. But so then that's a picture of me when I was a little boy with my mother. Now my mother, obviously, is this sort of glimmer of hope in that story, right? And why did my great-grandmother say, I can't look after my mother tonight? I don't know, was that God intervening? Was that like one of these kind of dream type things? If so, it sounds very wonderful. It also sounds really unfair, right? Because, well, why not everybody else? And we have to wrestle with these mixtures, right, in our life where we we want to believe that God is present and working through things, but then in other situations it seems like God is so absent, right? It can seem so unfair, so difficult. I came along on the scene, and as I said, I was somewhat, my grandmother, the apple of her eye, I'd say to some degree, until my son came along. So George is the third of our kids, and where's Ollie? No offense to Ollie, because Ollie's he's just this phenomenal fourth son. But for whatever reason, my grandmother thought that George looked even more like the previous George than I did, and suddenly I was out and George was in. and he does look a little bit more like those pictures, I think. I think we've got another picture of him here later on in life, when he's a seasoned campaigner, George. Yeah, so that's my grandmother. This is about, I don't know, so George is about 3 there probably, so that's about 17 years ago. So it's not long before my grandmother died. So that, to me, that's an image of hope, right? That's an image of hope. My grandmother lived a very difficult life, a very hard life. And I think she was, if you talk to my mother, not an easy woman to live with, not an easy woman to have as your mother. But what I see here is a woman who persevered, a woman who stayed with it, a woman who kept going, who didn't give up, who kind of accepted the reality of the pain that she was in, who was not looking for a magic wand to be waved for it all to go away, and obviously had no choices about that either, but who persevered through. And I guess what I want to get at this morning as we talk about this story in light of the Christmas story is this: that we have all kinds of things going on in our lives, right? If we were just to canvass the group here this morning, we may not have pulled relatives' body parts out of rubble. We haven't, thank God, had to go through those kinds of things, right? Some of us have been in, I'm sure, all kinds of very traumatic situations. Some of us have experienced things that we've probably shared with very few other people that are awful things. Some of us have done awful things, right? We've made really bad choices. Some awful things have happened to us. Some things have just happened because of circumstances and what might seem like luck. But every single one of us, to some degree, struggles with things that seem out of our control and that don't seem to change. There may be relationships where we just wish that other person would behave differently or be different. And yet we have no control over that, no matter how hard we try, or how hard we try to manipulate that other person or get them to be different or whatever. Whatever relationship it is, there's all kinds of painful situations in our life. And I'm not convinced that Christmas is telling us that one day everything's going to be okay, so don't worry, just hope in the future. It'll all be fine. There may be that sentiment to some degree at Christmas, but to me that doesn't seem that miraculous, really. What seems miraculous is that God would come into all this pain with us, that God would come into this darkness, God would be present, walking through these situations with us, so that we can persevere, so that we can be in these situations. The miracle of Christmas is that God would be that vulnerable. The Christmas story shows not a God outside of the system moving all the pieces around, but a God in the system, subject to the system. It's like God is saying, okay, I'm going to be subject to Herod. I'm going to be subject to Quirinius, to Augustus Caesar. And my presence, my power, this different kind of power, is going to empower humanity to endure, to be in these difficulties. And I want us to think about it this morning. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we can think about this, but think about it in 3 ways. So let's sort of perhaps begin to relate to some of the situations that we ourselves struggle with, right? Some of those painful situations. I mean, some of us are facing death. Some of us are facing grief. Some of us are facing unbelievable loss. Some of us are trying to deal with incredible trauma. We're all working through stuff. As we think about those and feel some of those, perhaps even now, let's relate to them in 3 ways. The first one is this: perseverance. I talked about that in terms of my grandmother, that the presence of God in our lives, Emmanuel, God with us, empowers us to keep on doing good, no matter what happens to us, to keep on loving, to keep on staying on the side of hope and love rather than bitterness and victim and anger and hardness, right? That we can persevere in that way. We can, no matter what our situation is, we can keep going. We can be in that situation. We can think about it from the perspective of this week's theme, peace. And this is something I think we're talking about my grandmother, that she really struggled with. I don't think she was a woman that was at peace. She hadn't really come to a place of being able to deal with what she'd been through and relate to it as a reality. So peace to me it's like rest. Whatever situation we're in, can we, without condoning that situation, without saying that situation is good, or even saying we don't want that situation to change. We may still want the situation to change, of course, but can we come to terms with that situation to the point where we would be at rest in it, in our circumstances? Still persevering, still struggling, but can we be at rest where we would actually begin to open our hearts up and say, what needs to take place in my life? What healing needs to happen? How does my approach, my attitude, the things that I can control, how do they need to change? How can I love better? How can I do more good? How can I grow as a result of this situation I'm in? And I don't in any way want to minimize the enormity of some of the situations that we face. But for me, the miracle of Christmas is this miracle of peace, that God comes into the situation and says, be at peace. God doesn't come waving a magic wand, making everything better, and now you can be at peace. But God comes into the situation, into the darkness, and brings peace, brings a sense of rest, a sense of it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And then the third thing, not surprisingly I think, is love. Can we, in all of this darkness, can we love? For me, the greatest miracle of Christmas is that love comes into this darkness. Love comes into this suffering. Love comes into this pain. And we can think about that as perhaps at a very personal level. Like when bad stuff happens to us, we frequently think we've done something wrong. It's our fault. We may even think that about other people. If something happens to somebody, we think, oh, well, they can't be a good person. I mean, all kinds of wacky thoughts come into mind. But we think of about that with ourselves, especially. I've lost count of the number of people I've talked to who I've just simply had to say, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. This doesn't make you a bad person. In fact, I try to call out in that person, it's incredible how you've endured. It's incredible how you haven't caved under all that has happened to you. But very frequently our first human instinct is to think we've done something wrong. And we translate that, unfortunately, into religious dogma, which is, God doesn't like us. That God thinks we're really bad until proved otherwise. And God is quite happy to dish out all this death and judgment because we deserve it anyway. So perhaps stage one of love is saying, in this situation I'm struggling with, I'm just going to put aside any sense of blaming myself. I might need to put certain things right. I might need to change certain behaviors. But I'm going to start from the perspective that God loves me. That God is for me, accepts me, totally loves me. And then I'm going to start thinking, how can I show love in this situation? Show love to my enemies, show love to the people that are hurting me. How can I allow this situation even to produce love in me? And how can I therefore love other people? Now I think this is a crucial thing, particularly where it relates to my grandmother's story. Because, as I mentioned, I don't think my grandmother was an easy person to grow up with, and my mother grew up with her as her mother. But I saw my mother love my grandmother in a way that, in some ways, my grandmother didn't deserve, given how she treated my mother. And we have this, hope in any situation. There's hope, maybe retrospective hope you could call it, in that story I just shared, which is my mother loving my grandmother. My grandmother found it hard to love, but my mother could love her. And we get a chance in life to bring hope into situations by loving people who are difficult to love. And people are often difficult to love because of their backstory, right? We all have people in our lives, let's just narrow it down to work, okay, so we don't get too personal, but we all have people in our lives who are a pain in the neck, right? Just run the list now, and you're just like, every time they email you, every time they say something, it's like, oh gosh, that's just normal part of life. But that person has a backstory. That person has a reason why they may be difficult. And obviously, we might find them difficult because it's us, right? We're the problem. But think about people's backstories and why people are the way they are. We have this opportunity in the here and now, in that darkness, in that difficulty, in that situation, to bring hope because we can love those people. I have been able to love my mother, and I hope my kids love me. But we have this opportunity to move away from that darkness through love, right? We can overcome that fear. We can overcome bitterness. We can overcome it through love. But that's not just for us. That's us loving other people, putting love and hope and light into other situations by the way that we treat people. So as we come to, we're going to close out here. I'm going to light this this second candle for peace. Maybe we could just put the lights down a fraction. We've got a prayer that's going to come up on the screen that we're going to say together in a second. But I'm just going to light this candle. And I want us to reflect for a moment. I hope it's going to light. Oh yeah, there it goes. Well, that's a really bad omen. It's going to go out. What happened there? This is the candle that represents peace. Wait for it. It's the season of Advent, the season of waiting. Oh well. This is the other thing. Wasn't you, Jermaine? You said that nothing goes according to plan, right? You said that the plan changes. So we've got a dub candle. There we go. So here's the candle of peace. We're just going to take a minute here, and in a moment a prayer will appear on the screen, and we're going to pray that together in a second, not just right now. But I just want to step out of the way here, just focus on these candles. These candles represent hope and peace. Let's just take a moment of silence, and just let those situations in your own life, there may be thoughts, right? You're thinking about something, a dark situation. You may be feeling that situation right now. It may be a historical situation. It may be a present situation. It may be a fear about the future. It might even be just looking at the world, right? Situations in the world that just weigh almost hopelessly on us. And let's just take a moment to reflect and invite God's presence, God with us, in those three areas of perseverance, peace and rest, and love. Okay, so let's just take a moment. Okay, let's pray this prayer together, and then the band are going to play for us. God, we confess that in all our business, our stress, and even our excitement, we often miss you. We open our hearts to your presence. God, you are in us, and we are in you. We are one. We embrace your hope in us and in the world. As we light this candle, may our hearts find rest in your heart. We receive your peace, and may peace fill all the world.